The knife was already at her throat before Ophelia Sinclair had time to scream. She had walked into the East Wing storage room to retrieve fresh linen for the guest chambers. The same task she had performed every Tuesday morning for the past 4 months, and now a man with hollow eyes and the faint silver shimmer of enchanted steel pressed cold metal against her pulse. Her hands went still, her heartbeat, she knew with horrible certainty, was the most dangerous sound in the room. "Tell me where he sleeps," the man whispered. His voice was cultured, clipped, the kind of voice that belonged to old money and older grudges. "Tell me, and I will let you walk out of here alive." "You are just a maid, you owe him nothing." Ophelia said nothing. She was cataloguing exits, the angle of the blade, the proximity of the iron shelf rack to her left. The single narrow window letting in the grey November light of London far above. She was afraid, genuinely afraid, the kind of fear that hollows your stomach and sharpens everything into terrible clarity. But she was not yet ready to give him what he wanted. What she could not have anticipated was the sound that followed. It was not a footstep. It was not a door. It was simply a presence, sudden and absolute. The way a storm arrives, not gradually, but all at once, pressure dropping, air changing, every animal instinct in the body, screaming that something ancient and apex level had entered the space. The temperature dropped 4 degrees. She felt it on her skin. "Remove the blade," said a voice like dark water over stone, quiet and perfectly unhurried, "or I will remove the hand holding it." The man spun, dragging Ophelia with him. And then he made a sound she had never heard a grown man make before, a breathless animal noise of pure terror, because Theron Radu was standing in the doorway. He was tall, more than 6 feet, and white in the way that marble is white, in the way that winter sky before snowfall is white, a whiteness that was not pallor but presence. His hair, the color of fresh snow, fell to his jaw in a way that was somehow both careless and deliberately intimidating. His eyes were not red. She had expected red, in the stories, in the myths. They were a pale, burning silver that caught light from no visible source. He wore a dark charcoal suit that cost more than her annual salary, and he looked at the man holding a knife to her throat, the way a king looks at a broken cobblestone on his private road. Not frightened, not even particularly angry. Simply certain that the inconvenience would be resolved. "You came into my house," Theron said, taking one unhurried step forward, "with a silver blade into my storage wing on a Tuesday, and you chose my maid as your leverage." Another step. The man behind Ophelia was shaking now, the knife trembling against her skin. "That tells me several things about you. The most important of which is that whoever sent you gave you very poor information about what I tolerate." The knife dropped. The man bolted. He made it 4 steps before Theron moved, and the speed of it made Ophelia's vision blur, the kind of speed that bypassed the eye and registered only as aftermath. A man against the far wall, a pale hand at his collar, a face very close and very still. What happened next was not what she expected. Theron did not bite him. He did not kill him. He held the man against the wall for exactly 3 seconds, said something low and brief in a language she did not recognize, and then the man's eyes glazed, unfocused, and when Theron released him he walked, docile as a sleepwalker, out of the room, and presumably toward the exit he had entered through. Theron turned around. He looked at Ophelia Sinclair for a long moment, his silver eyes moving from her throat to her hands, which she had pressed flat against her thighs to stop them trembling, to her face, which she was doing her absolute best to keep composed. "You did not scream," he said. "No," she agreed. "You did not tell him." "No." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, nearly invisible. The kind of shift she had learned to watch for in 4 months of moving quietly through his house. And she had come to understand that with Theron Radu the smallest movements carried the most weight. "Come with me," he said. She followed him. This required some explanation of how Ophelia Sinclair had come to live in the London residence of the Vampire King, which was what the other household staff called him in whispers they did not realize she could hear. The formal title, as she understood it, was Sovereign of the Dusk Court, which governed all vampire kind in the northern European territories from an ancient, reconfigured Victorian townhouse in Mayfair that looked, from the outside, like a very expensive private members' club. Ophelia had been placed by an employment agency that asked no questions and paid triple the market rate. She was 26, had a degree in art history she was not using, had lived alone since she was 19, and had a quality that her mother had always called inconvenient stubbornness, and that Ophelia preferred to think of as a high threshold for being frightened away from things. She had known on the second day what she was looking for. Humans who worked in such households almost always did. It was not advertised. It was also not concealed from anyone paying attention, which Ophelia always was. She had asked no questions. She had done her work. She had been given a contract with very specific provisions, one of which stated clearly that no vampire in the household would feed from any staff member without explicit voluntary consent, and that violation of this provision was treated as a criminal act under the treaty that governed vampire-human relations in the United Kingdom. She had read every word. She had signed it. What she had not anticipated was noticing him. Theron Radu did not move through his own house the way she had expected royalty to move. She had expected performance the kind of grandeur that demanded witness. He moved instead like someone for whom the house was simply an extension of himself, quiet and certain, occupying space without effort. She noticed early that he read in the East Library from 2 to 4 in the morning, when the rest of the staff were sleeping, and that he left his coffee cup exactly 4 inches from the edge of whatever surface he set it on, never more, never less. She noticed that he received visitors in the formal parlor, but conducted whatever business actually mattered to him in the smaller study at the back of the house, and that he stood at the window of that study for long periods, looking at nothing visible, which was either grief or thought, and sometimes, she suspected, was both. She noticed that he was alone in a way that had nothing to do with the people around him. She had told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that none of this was her concern. The study now was lit by the amber glow of 3 standing lamps, and Theron poured something dark into a glass that was not for her, and set a separate cup of tea on the edge of the desk without being asked. She looked at the tea. She looked at him. "How did you know?" she said. He sat in the chair behind the desk, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, the glass held loosely. "I own the house. I hear everything that breathes in it. You could have come sooner." "I arrived in time, barely, exactly in time," he corrected. Not defensive, simply precise the way he said most things. "Had I arrived earlier, you would not have had the opportunity to demonstrate that you were not going to tell him where I sleep, which tells me considerably more about your character than 4 months of observation already had." She stared at him. That was a test." "No, that was an assessment I chose not to interrupt prematurely." He lifted the glass, considered it. "There is a difference. A test implies I engineered the danger. I did not. The man's name is Dorian Kessler. He works for a faction of my own court, who believe I have become too lenient in my governance of the human vampire accords. They have been sending scouts into the residence for 6 weeks. You were simply in the wrong room, and the right test subject," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice, the one that came out when she was frightened and needed to convert the fear into something useful. He looked at her directly. "You are angry." "I am calibrating," she said. "There is a difference." Something moved through his expression again, quick and warm and immediately contained, like a match struck in a dark room and then cupped by careful hands. "Sit down, Ophelia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, though she could not have said exactly, when she had begun thinking of him simply as Theron in the privacy of her own mind. She sat. She drank the tea. It was exactly the right temperature, which meant he had known already that this conversation was going to happen. "Tell me about the faction," she said. He looked at her for a moment, as if recalibrating what kind of conversation this was going to be. "The Dusk Court," he said carefully, "has held the northern European territories for 400 years. My family established the accords with the human governing bodies at the end of the 17th century. Coexistence, structured. No feeding from unwilling humans, no interference in human political systems, no territorial expansion through violence." He set the glass down. "There are those in my court who believe these constraints have made us weak, that I have sacrificed ancient power for the comfort of humans who would never extend us equivalent protection." "Would they?" she asked. "Extend equivalent protection?" "Some would," he said. "Most would not if it came to genuine conflict." That sounds like a lonely position to hold. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the previous silences. It had weight and texture, and she thought she had made a mistake. Pushed too far past the professional line she had been carefully not crossing for 4 months. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes, it is." She did not know what to do with the fact that her heart ached for him. So she filed it away and asked the practical question. "What happens now, with Kessler's people?" "I will hold a court session tomorrow evening. The faction will be given the opportunity to present their grievances formally. I will listen." His voice was even. "And then I will make clear, with appropriate finality, that loyalty in my court is not optional. And Kessler has been removed from London. He will not return." "You sent him away with a memory adjustment," she said. "Not with punishment." "I sent him away with a warning he will feel in his bones for a century," Theron said. "Memory adjustment, as you call it, is a more intricate thing than it appears. What I gave him was not absence, it was clarity. He understands now at a level Avini thought exactly what I am and exactly what I am capable of. That is a more lasting deterrent than any physical punishment I could have administered." Ophelia considered this. "That is either very wise or very merciful." "In my experience," he said, "they are rarely separable." She stood, because she could feel the conversation shifting into territory that would make it harder to maintain the professional distance she needed to maintain. And she was self-aware enough to know that. "I will change the linen in the east guest rooms," she said. "Ophelia." She turned. He was looking at her with those pale silver eyes, and there was something in them she had not seen before, something deliberate and careful, like a man placing a very heavy object down somewhere safe. "Thank you," he said, "for not telling him." "Of course," she said. She left the study. She made it to the third-floor landing before she had to stop, press her back against the wall, and breathe through the shaking that had been waiting patiently the entire time to arrive. The court session the following evening began at 9 and lasted past midnight. Ophelia heard the voices from the upper gallery where she had absolutely no business being, but the geometry of the house made the sound travel in a way she could not easily ignore, and she had stopped pretending that she was not curious about Theron Radu's world approximately 3 months and 27 days ago. She sat in the shadows above the formal hall and watched. There were 14 vampires in the hall below. She recognized 3 of them from regular visits to the house. The rest were strangers to her, which meant they were not part of the resident staff or the usual diplomatic circuit, which meant they were the faction. She could identify them not by anything obvious, but by the way they held themselves. A particular rigidity around the shoulders, the way their gaze kept returning to Theron, where he sat at the head of the long table with the precise, immovable quality of a statue that had decided to become a king. The vampire who spoke for the faction was named Valerius Drace. Ophelia gathered this from context. He was older looking than Theron, which she now understood meant almost nothing in terms of actual age. But there was something about him that suggested deep age in his bone structure, in the way he moved with the terrible economy of something that had not needed to hurry in several centuries. His hair was white like Theron's but longer, worn pulled back, and his eyes were the pale gold of old amber. He made his argument in 3 parts, and she had to admit, listening from above, that it was not an unintelligent argument. The Accords, he said, constrained vampire society in ways that served human interests disproportionately. The feeding provisions created a dependency on voluntarily offered blood that was not guaranteed in perpetuity. The territorial restrictions prevented the court from responding adequately to threats from other vampire factions in southern territories who operated under no equivalent constraints. He was articulate and cold, and clearly very old and very sure of himself. Theron listened to all of it without expression. Then he spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He sat with the same absolute stillness he always carried, and what he said was this. The Accords had held for 400 years because they were not an act of submission but an act of strategy. That a court which survived by force alone survived only until it encountered a superior force. That the human vampire Accords had created a network of mutual investment that had protected vampire society in the Northern Territories through 3 wars, 2 plagues, and the complete reorganization of European human governance. That the factions' grievances were not without merit, but their proposed solution was one that Theron Radu had considered in depth and rejected. "And if we do not accept your rejection?" Valerius said, very quiet. "Then you are declaring yourself in opposition to this court," Theron said, equally quiet, "and you know the laws that govern that declaration. The old blood law." Ophelia had read about it in the brief she had been given when she signed her contract, the provision that described it as an ancient and rarely invoked statute that granted the sovereign unilateral authority to resolve open opposition to the court's governance. It was politely worded. The implication was not polite. Valerius held the silence for a long moment. Then he said, "We are not declaring opposition. We are registering formal dissent." "Which is your right," Theron said, "and it has been received. Your dissent is noted in the court record. Your concerns will be addressed through the policy review process which convenes in the spring. You are welcome to submit formal proposals." He looked at Valerius with those silver eyes, and even from the gallery above, Ophelia felt the impact of it. "But let me be entirely clear, Valerius. If anyone from your faction enters this residence again, with a silver blade and a human hostage, the conversation we have will be different from this one." The silence that followed was not comfortable. But it broke. Eventually, the way silences under that kind of pressure always broke, and the faction filed out and the court session ended. Theron sat alone at the table for a moment after they left. Ophelia watched him. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers briefly against his temple, a gesture so small and so human that it knocked something loose in her chest. It was the gesture of someone who was very tired and very practiced at not showing it. She left the gallery and went to bed and did not sleep for a long time. 3 days later, she found the letter. It was not addressed to her. It had been slipped under the door of the east storage room where she was working, which was either a mistake or deliberate misdirection, and the handwriting on the envelope was the angular, slightly archaic script she had come to associate with vampire correspondence. There was no name on it. Just a wax seal she did not recognize, different from the Dusk Court's seal, pressed in dark red. She should have taken it directly to Theron. She knew this. What she did instead, because she was exactly as curious as she was cautious, was look at it very closely before touching it. Note that the seal was unbroken. Note that the envelope was not addressed to anyone and had no sender marking. And then carry it, sealed, to the study where Theron was working at 7 in the evening. She set it on the corner of the desk. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Where did you find this?" she told him. His expression did not change, but something in the air did. A subtle increase in that particular quality of stillness that she had learned meant he was very focused and very controlled about something that warranted neither. He broke the seal. She watched his face as he read it. She had become, over the past months, something of a scholar of his face, the micro-architecture of it, the way the set of his jaw telegraphed things that the neutrality of his eyes concealed. It was not a hobby she had chosen. It had simply developed, the way any careful attention develops toward things that matter. What she saw now was, in sequence, recognition, a brief narrowing of focus, and then something slower and darker, the expression of a man who had opened a door he had been hoping would stay closed. "What is it?" she said. He looked up. He seemed to make a decision. "It is from Mira Voss. Who is she?" "She was my consort," he said, "for approximately 40 years, which ended 2 centuries ago. She currently leads the Southern Court out of Budapest." He set the letter down flat on the desk. "She is telling me that the faction's contact in her court, the Southern connection that makes Valerius's position militarily viable, has agreed to a formal alliance against my governance. She is telling me this as a courtesy, or as a warning. With Mira, those are often the same thing. Is she your ally?" "She is someone who has never quite decided," he said, which was a more honest answer than she had expected. "We have a complicated history. She believes I am too rigid in my commitments, and too sentimental about the accords. She is not wrong that the accords create constraints. She is wrong about what those jaw constraints are worth." "She told you about the alliance," Ophelia said. "That is not nothing." He looked at her. "No, it is not nothing. It means she does not entirely want you destroyed." "An encouraging minimum," he said, very dry, and she surprised herself by almost smiling. "So, the faction has Southern military backing," she said. "What does that change for the spring policy review?" "It changes the balance of power considerably. With Mira's court's resource behind them, the faction is no longer a dissenting minority. They are a viable opposition. He stood, moved to the window with that particular quality of motion that she had stopped being startled by, the kind of movement that was somehow both deliberate and frictionless. I have 14 loyal members of the Dusk Court. The faction has 7 members formally. With Southern backing, they have resources I cannot easily match through internal politics. She was quiet for a moment, turning the problem over. Can you contact Mira, she said, directly, not through court channels. Then do that. She told you about the alliance. She is extending something, even if she will not call it an olive branch. If you reach out directly outside the formal court framework, you are speaking to her as an individual, not as a competing sovereign. That is different. She paused. People make different choices when they are spoken to as people, rather than as positions. He turned from the window and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. You are remarkably good at this, he said. I read people, she said simply. It is a thing I have always done. It is more than reading, he said. You understand the architecture of it, the way people need to be approached to hear what you actually mean. He came away from the window and stood on the other side of the desk, which put approximately 3 feet between them, which was close enough that she could see the exact quality of the light in his silver eyes. Where did that come from? She considered not answering. Then she said, I grew up with a father who was very difficult to reach. I learned to find angles. He is gone now, 3 years ago. He was not a bad man. He was just very far away, even when he was present. She paused. It made me good at reading distance in other people. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had texture and meaning, and she was aware, with a clarity that was almost inconvenient, that something had shifted in the room, that they had moved from employer and employee, and from whatever uncomfortable mutual orbit they had been holding since the knife incident into something neither of them had exactly named. I will contact Mira, he said. Good, she said. She picked up the letter, folded it exactly as it had been folded, and set it in the small brass box on the corner of the desk, where she had observed he kept correspondence that required follow-up. Good night, Theron, she said. It was the first time she had used his name to his face. He said nothing for a moment. Then, good night, Ophelia. She left. The next several weeks had a particular quality to them, a careful warmth, like the first real sunlight after a northern winter, the kind you did not quite trust because you had been cold for so long. He began leaving things for her, not ostentatiously. A new edition of an art history text left on the hall table with no explanation. The correct type of tea, ordered specifically, replacing the general-purpose blend that had been in the kitchen before. A note once, written in that angular script, that said only, The Titian on the second-floor landing is genuine. I thought you would want to know. She had been examining it for 3 days when she found the note. She had thought it might be genuine. She put the note in the inside pocket of her jacket and did not examine why. She began staying later in the evenings, finding small tasks that required her presence in rooms where he was likely to be working. This was not professional. She was clear-eyed about that. She was also, with equal clarity, incapable of making herself stop. They talked. About the court, about the Accords, about history he had witnessed firsthand that she had studied in books, and which turned out to be, in his telling, both more ordinary and more complicated than the historical record suggested. She told him about art, about the theory and emotional grammar of it, and he listened with a quality of attention that she was not accustomed to, the kind that did not wait for its turn to speak, but simply received what she was saying, and turned it over, genuinely curious. She learned that he had not slept in a traditional sense for 2 centuries, that he rested in a deep meditative state that served the same function, that he found genuine darkness, the kind without even the glow of the city beyond the curtains, necessary for this, and that the east wing of the upper floors was configured specifically for this purpose. She learned that he had been made vampire at the age of 29 in what was now Romania, in the year 1641, and that his maker had been killed in a territorial conflict 60 years later, and that Theron had spent the following decade working through something he described only as a period of significant adjustment. She recognized grief when it was described in careful, oblique language, because she had spent her childhood doing the same. She learned that he liked music in the modern sense, specifically jazz and certain kinds of ambient electronic composition, which was not what she had expected from someone 4 centuries old. He told her that the most interesting thing about living, as long as he had, was that the world kept inventing entirely new kinds of beauty, and that each one was a gift he had not anticipated. She thought about that for a long time after he said it. The response from Mira Voss came on a Wednesday in December, and Theron brought it to her. This was unusual. He was the one receiving correspondence, not delivering it, and she was in the first-floor drawing room polishing silver. She had already polished the previous week when he appeared in the doorway and said, "She has agreed to a meeting in Vienna at the end of January." Ophelia set down the silver cloth. "That is good news. It is complicated news." He came into the room, something he rarely did when she was working in a space, preferring to observe the professional boundary, even when she privately wished he would ignore it. "Mira will meet with me, but she has conditions. She wants an independent witness present, someone who is not affiliated with either court." She looked at him. She knew from the particular quality of his stillness what he was about to say. "She knows I employ a human staff," he said carefully. "She has proposed that I bring one of my human staff members as the independent witness. She believes, I think, that the presence of a human will create a particular dynamic, one that moderates any tendency toward formal court maneuvering." "She is cleverer than you gave her credit for," Ophelia said. "She always was." He paused. "I would not ask you to come to Vienna if you were not willing. This is outside any reasonable professional obligation. The meeting itself carries risk. Mira is not my enemy, but she is not my ally, and Vienna in January is deep in territory where my court's protection does not fully extend." Ophelia looked at him. She thought about what it would mean to say no. To stay in the Mayfair townhouse and polish silver and keep the careful distance she had been eroding for weeks. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. Not just to Vienna, not just to the meeting, but to what saying yes would signify. The stepping forward, the acknowledgement of the thing neither of them had named. "What would my role be exactly?" she said. "In the meeting, witness observer, someone who can provide, if needed, a human perspective on the accords and what they mean in practical terms." He paused. "And someone whose presence communicates without words, that I take the human-vampire relationship seriously enough to include a human in a high-level diplomatic exchange." "A statement," she said. "Yes, you want to use me as a political statement." "I want to bring you," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, the precision that he usually maintained over it giving just enough that she heard something underneath that was not political and not diplomatic and was simply direct. "The political function is a secondary consideration." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, Vienna." Something moved across his face, brief and real and unguarded. The first fully unguarded expression she had seen from him, and she decided quietly in the privacy of her own chest that she was entirely lost and had probably been so for longer than she had been willing to admit. Vienna in January was achingly beautiful and bone-deep cold, the kind of cold that the old city seemed to generate from its own stones. Gothic spires and Baroque facades, and the Danube moving dark and heavy beneath bridges, lined with the pale ghosts of street lamps reflected in ice. They arrived by private car. 3 hours from London by chartered flight, and then the drive through the old city. And Ophelia sat beside Theron in the back seat and watched Vienna unfold outside the window, and tried not to be aware of how close they were, or of the fact that he had placed himself between her and the car door on the street side. A detail so instinctive and so characteristic that it made her throat tight. The meeting was in a private dining room of a hotel that had been operating continuously since the 18th century, and understood, in the way these establishments did, that certain guests required certain accommodations, and that discretion was the most valuable thing on the menu. Mira Voss was extraordinary. Ophelia had known, intellectually, that an 800-year-old vampire who led a major court would be extraordinary. The reality was still a shock to the system. Mira was small, by vampire standards, not short but compact and precise, with silver-white hair cut to a sharp angle at her jaw and eyes that were the pale, cold green of shallow Arctic water. She wore dark green silk and she moved like something that had decided, long ago, to be exactly what it was with no concession to the comfort of observers. She looked at Ophelia for a long time when they entered the room, not rudely, assessingly. "So," she said, in English with a faint, complex accent that contained at least 3 languages in its history, "this is the human who did not tell Kessler where Theron sleeps." "Ophelia Sinclair," Ophelia said, and met her eyes, which was not the comfortable thing to do but was the right one. Mira smiled. It was a genuine smile, which Ophelia had not entirely expected. "I see," she said, in a tone that suggested she saw considerably more than the sentence implied. She looked at Theron. "You brought her because I asked for a witness," she said. "But that is not the only reason." "No," he said, "it is not." "Interesting." Mira sat. "Sit down, both of you. Let us discuss the end of a war before it begins." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. It was the most extraordinary 4 hours of Ophelia's life, and she had lived through enough extraordinary hours to set a reasonable baseline. Mira laid out the faction's strategy with the dispassionate clarity of someone who found it professionally interesting even while opposing it. The Southern Court's resources, the timeline, the 3 specific leverage points that Valerius planned to use at the spring policy review to force a formal vote on the Accords. She laid all of this out because she did not, ultimately, want the Accords destroyed, and she told them why. Not sentiment, not fondness for Theron, not any political alliance, but pure pragmatic calculation. The Accords had created a structure. Destroying the structure was easy. Building a replacement was the work of generations. Mira was old enough to have lived through the last time there had been no structure, and she had not enjoyed it. "The faction needs something," she said to Theron. "That is the only way you resolve this without open conflict. Not appeasement, not capitulation, but something that addresses the legitimate core of what they are objecting to. The feeding provisions," he said. "The dependency they create. Yes, what if those provisions were renegotiated? Not eliminated. Renegotiated, with terms that gave vampire society more autonomy in establishing voluntary fee-feeding relationships without the current administrative requirements that the faction finds humiliating." Ophelia said, without quite deciding to. "The human governing bodies would need to agree to any renegotiation. The question is what they would want in return." Both vampires looked at her. She did not flinch from it. "The Accords are a bilateral agreement. You cannot change one side without negotiating with the other. If you approach the human diplomatic contacts with a genuine proposal for renegotiation rather than waiting for them to impose changes, you control the framing. You come in with a good faith offer and you shape what the new terms look like." A silence. "She is not wrong," Mira said, looking at Theron with an expression that was warm and rueful and slightly envious in a way that Ophelia did not entirely understand but filed away. "She is rarely wrong," Theron said, and the way he said it was perfectly quiet and completely unambiguous, and Ophelia felt it land in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving out in all directions. Mira looked between them for a moment. Then she said, well, that is new." The framework they agreed on that evening in Vienna became the basis for the spring policy review. Mira withdrew the Southern Court's backing from the faction, which removed the military viability of Valerius's position and reduced his opposition from existential threat to manageable dissent. Theron brought the renegotiation proposal to the human diplomatic contacts in February, framing it himself rather than working through intermediaries, which was unprecedented and which the human contacts responded to with cautious but genuine interest. By the time the spring review convened, the faction had 3 options. Engage with the renegotiation process through legitimate channels, continue a formal dissent that no longer had the force to change anything, or declare open opposition under the old blood law, which none of them chose because they were, despite everything, not stupid. Valerius submitted a formal proposal through the renegotiation process. It was not a good proposal, but it was a proposal, which meant he was working within the structure, and working within the structure was the beginning of a different kind of relationship. All of this happened in the 3 months between Vienna and spring. And while it happened, something else was happening. Quieter, and with less political consequence and considerably more personal weight, Theron began asking her opinion. Not as a political calculation, not as the employment of a useful skill, but in the way people ask opinions of people they trust, with genuine curiosity about the answer. He asked what she thought of the renegotiation language. He asked whether she thought Valerius believed his own arguments or was simply executing a power strategy. He asked, one evening in February when they were both in the study late, whether she had ever wanted something that she had good reasons to believe she should not have. She looked up from the book she was not really reading. Yes, she said. Often. How do you resolve it? He said. The wanting versus the reasons. Usually, she said, by making myself sit with both of them long enough to understand which one is real and which one is a story I am telling myself. He was quiet for a moment. And which one is usually real? That depends, she said, on the thing. He looked at her with those silver eyes, and the lamplight between them was very warm, and they were sitting considerably closer than they usually sat, a fact she had noticed and not addressed approximately 40 minutes earlier, when the distance had reduced without either of them initiating it. Ophelia, he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she could not name, but that she felt through her entire nervous system. I know, she said quietly. I am 400 years old, he said. I am not human. The life I lead is not safe. The enemies I have are not theoretical. I have watched everyone who has been close to me either leave or be taken, and I have arrived at an arrangement with that reality that involves a considerable quantity of distance. I know all of that, she said. I am not certain, he said, slowly and carefully, and with a precision she recognized as him taking something extremely seriously, that I know how to do this without hurting you. I have not asked for anything in a very long time. I have not allowed myself to. She set the book down. She looked at him. Theron, she said, I have been watching you for months. I have seen you manage a court and a diplomatic crisis and a physical threat to my life, and not one time, not once, have I seen you ask anyone for help. Not because you didn't need it, but because asking felt like exposure, and exposure felt like something you couldn't afford. She paused. I am telling you now that you can afford it, at least with me. He was very still. How do you know that? He said. With certainty. I don't know anything with certainty, she said. But I know that you have had 400 years of being alone in a room full of people who need something from you. And I am the first person in this house who has not needed anything from you, and you noticed that, immediately, and it changed how you treated me. And that tells me something about what you need that I think you have spent a very long time pretending you do not need. The silence was very long. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with any of the theatrical grandeur she might have associated with a 400-year-old vampire king. Simply, carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of damaging. I do not know how to do this carefully, he said again, very low. Then do it imperfectly, she said. I can manage imperfect. He looked at her for a long moment, and then the distance between them closed, not all at once but in stages, each one deliberate, as if he was asking permission at every point and receiving it, until he pressed his mouth to hers, and she discovered that the warmth she had felt in his presence for months was not the ambient temperature of the room, but something he carried in him. Something that had nothing to do with human biology and everything to do with 4 centuries of compressed feeling that had found, finally, something it recognized. She kissed him back and put her hand against his jaw and felt, beneath her palm, the extraordinary stillness of him, the complete attention, every part of him present and unhurried and entirely, completely there. When they separated, she was breathing harder than usual. He was very still and very bright-eyed, and she would not have called the expression on his face vulnerable, except that it was. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. What followed was not simple, because nothing involving a vampire king, an ancient court, and a human maid could be simple, but it was real, which was the more important thing. The practical complications were considerable. Her contract was structured for an employer-employee relationship, and what was developing was categorically different, which meant the contract needed to be renegotiated, which meant the rest of the household staff needed to understand the shift in dynamic, which meant several carefully structured conversations with people who reacted with varying degrees of equanimity. Most of the staff had seen it coming, which was simultaneously obvious in retrospect and somehow surprising. Heloise, who was the head of household and who had worked for the Dusk Court for 30 years, told Ophelia with a perfectly straight face that she had given it 12 weeks from the day Ophelia arrived, which was more quickly than anyone else had wagered. Anyone else, Ophelia repeated. There was a staff pool, Heloise said, serenely unrepentant. 12 weeks was the fastest anyone bet. You actually beat it by 2 weeks, which means I owe Darius £20. Ophelia stared at her. Then she started laughing, genuinely and completely, and it felt very good. The court was a more complicated conversation. Theron called a full session in March, after the spring policy review, when the faction situation had been stabilized and the renegotiation process was formally underway. He did not announce anything with ceremony. He presented the relevant facts as facts. That Ophelia Sinclair was no longer a member of his household staff, but a member of his household. That this was neither a political statement nor a diplomatic gesture, but a personal reality he expected the court to acknowledge and respect, and that anyone who had concerns could raise them through the formal process that existed for that purpose. Valerius said nothing. He had, Ophelia suspected, concluded that he had used his available capital for the season, a vampire named Sorin, who was one of Theron's oldest loyal court members, and who had a face that looked carved from something harder than most materials, raised his hand and asked, formally and without apparent irony, whether Miss Sinclair would be receiving a court introduction. Theron looked at Ophelia. She had been sitting in the gallery again, not hiding exactly, but not seated at the table either, maintaining the uncertain middle ground they had not yet fully defined. She met his eyes. If she wishes one, Theron said, and the careful, deliberate way he transferred the decision to her was the most publicly respectful thing she had ever seen him do, and she felt it in the way you feel things that matter. Yes, she said from the gallery. Every head in the hall turned to look at her. She met the collective gaze of the Dusk Court with the composure she had been developing for 4 months, in preparation for exactly this kind of moment, without knowing she was preparing for it. Yes, she said again. A court introduction would be appropriate. Sorin nodded, as if this settled the matter, which apparently it did. The court introduction was held on an evening in late March, when the London cold was beginning to soften, and the first suggestion of spring was in the air outside the townhouse windows. It was not a large ceremony, Theron having apparently very little patience for ceremony that could not be condensed, but it had weight. She stood in the formal hall, in the dark blue dress she had bought specifically because the color seemed right for the occasion. The night of the year's tilt toward warmth and Sorin read, in formal court language that was approximately 400 years old in its construction, the declaration of her standing as a recognized member of the household, with full protections under Dusk Court law. The protections were real. She understood this now in a way she had not entirely understood at the beginning. Under court law, any harm done to a recognized member of the sovereign's household was treated as harm done to the sovereign, which carried consequences that made Kessler's silver-bladed venture look like a parking ticket. She was not being made a vampire, had not been asked to be, and had not asked to be, which was its own conversation they had quietly and carefully had over 2 evenings in February, arriving at the honest conclusion that the decision was neither urgent nor foreclosed, and that neither of them needed to define the entirety of their future in order to inhabit the present. She was being given protection. Real protection, not the contractual variety, but the ancient and absolute kind. The kind built into 400 years of power and law, and the particular certainty of a man who had decided she was under his care and meant it in every sense that phrase could contain. When Sorin finished reading, Theron crossed the hall and stood in front of her and took her hand and said formally and simply, "Welcome." She looked at him. The silver in his eyes was very bright. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had put down something very heavy and not yet entirely processed the relief of it. "Thank you," she said. Then, because the moment called for something true, and she was always better at truth than at theatre, she added, quietly enough that it was between them rather than the room, "I am exactly where I want to be." His hand tightened on hers. The month that followed had a quality she had not known she was lacking in her life until she had it, which was the quality of being genuinely known by another person and choosing to know them in return without the particular exhaustion that performing a version of yourself requires. She stopped performing the version of Ophelia Sinclair, who was composed and competent and self-contained and not afraid of anything, because he did not need that version and seemed, in fact, to find her considerably more interesting when she was afraid, and said so, which was new. She said, on an April evening, when they were both in the upstairs sitting room she had claimed as her particular working space, that she was afraid of what happened in 10 years when she had aged and he had not. She said it plainly and without hedging, because she had decided months ago that the things that most needed to be said were the ones she had the strongest instinct to leave unsaid. He looked at her for a moment. "That is a fear I have also been living with," he said. "For longer than you have. What conclusion did you come to? That I refuse to let it preclude having this," he said. "That the future contains uncertainty by definition, and that I have spent 4 centuries treating uncertainty as a reason to hold myself apart from things I wanted, and that the cost of that approach is exactly the quality of aloneness I was carrying when you walked into my storage room 4 months before you didn't tell Kessler where I sleep." She was quiet. "We have time," he said, "to understand what we want, to make decisions about the future from a place of knowing each other rather than from fear. That does not require resolution today." "No," she agreed. "It does not." She thought about the conversation they had not yet had, the one about what it would mean to stay in his world indefinitely, to potentially, at some point that was neither pressing nor impossible, make the choice that was not reversible. She thought about it, the way she thought about most things that mattered, carefully and from multiple angles, and she discovered that the thought did not frighten her the way she would have expected. It sat in her chest with a weight that was not dread, but significance, which was different. She was not ready to make that decision. But she was not afraid of it. That, she thought, was probably the most honest thing she could say about where she was. The summer brought a crisis that nobody had anticipated, because crises of consequence rarely arrived on schedule. A diplomatic summit had been convened between the major European vampire courts and the relevant human governing bodies, the first such summit in 40 years, specifically to address the renegotiation process that had originated in Theron's Vienna conversation with Mira. It was held in Geneva, neutral ground in the geographic and political sense, and Theron attended with the senior Dusk Court members and Ophelia, who had become, over the preceding months, a genuinely useful participant in court diplomacy by virtue of her ability to read human reactions in ways that the vampires found difficult to replicate. The crisis arrived on the second day in the form of a human delegate named Carlyle, who had not been briefed on the personal dimension of the relationship between the Dusk Court sovereign and the woman sitting at his right hand. Carlyle made an assumption publicly and in front of 30 people that Ophelia was present in a professional capacity, and addressed a question about the human community's concerns to her directly, in a way that made clear he expected a staff answer. What she gave him was not a staff answer. She answered his question about human community concerns by drawing on 4 months of reading about the Accords and 6 months of living inside the court that governed them, which gave her a perspective that was neither purely human nor purely vampire, but was situated at the exact intersection where the actual relationship existed, the lived, daily, complicated reality of people and vampires sharing the world. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes without notes, calmly and specifically, and when she finished the room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Carlyle stared at her. "You are not staff," he said slowly. "No," she agreed. "I am Ophelia Sinclair, and this is the sovereign of the Dusk Court, whom I love, and I am at this table because I have something useful to contribute to this conversation, as I hope I have just demonstrated." To her left, she felt Theron go completely, perfectly still in that way he had, which she had come to understand meant he was overwhelmed in a manner he was actively managing, which was his version of the kind of emotion that other people expressed through visible means. Later, in the private suite the court had booked in the Geneva hotel, he said to her, "You said that in a room full of 30 people." "I know," she said. It seemed like the accurate thing to say. "You said you love me," he said very carefully, as if he was placing each word where it needed to go. "Yes," she said, "I do. That is not new information for me." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the room, and she would have backed up to give him space, except that she did not want space. She wanted the opposite of space. And so she stayed exactly where she was, and he took her face in his hands with a care that was entirely out of proportion to his strength, and kissed her in a way that had very little to do with restraint. "I love you," he said against her hair. Afterward, and his voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, something unguarded and raw, and that had clearly been waiting behind every careful word he had spoken in the months since January. "I have been, I think, for longer than I have allowed myself to acknowledge." "I know," she said, and she felt the vibration of his laugh against her temple. Quiet and real, the summit concluded successfully. The renegotiation framework was ratified by all major European courts and the relevant human governing bodies, a fact that made the headlines of the covert press that covered vampire-human relations, and that Theron read with the expression of a man who had worked very long and hard for something, and was still slightly surprised to see it exist. Valerius sent a formal court communication acknowledging the ratification, which was not an apology, and was not intended to be, but which represented the closing of a chapter in a way that they both recognized. Mira Voss attended the summit on the second day and spent 2 hours in conversation with Ophelia that Theron was not present for, and when they emerged from the hotel terrace where they had been talking, Mira looked at Ophelia with that complex, Arctic green gaze and said, "He chose well. I hope he knows that." "I will tell him you said so," Ophelia said. "He already knows," Mira said, "but tell him anyway. He should hear it from someone who knew him, before he knew himself, well enough to ask for anything." She understood then what that 400-year-old aloneness had actually looked like from the outside, to someone who had known him long enough to trace its history. It made something in her chest ache with a tenderness, so large she did not quite know what to do with it. She told him, that evening, what Mira had said. She watched his face when she said it, the movement through it that he did not suppress, and she held his hand and said nothing, because some things were better received in silence. "She is not wrong," he said finally quietly. "No," Ophelia agreed. "She is not." They went home to London. The townhouse in Mayfair in October was exactly as it had always been, the amber lamps and the high ceilings and the sound of the city beyond the Victorian windows. And she walked through the door and knew, with the particular certainty that settles in the body rather than the mind, that this was home in a way no place had been home to her in a very long time. She put her coat away in the front hall. Heloise came through with a tray and told them with great equanimity that there were messages from 3 different court members and that the kitchen had prepared dinner at 10, which was the time they both kept, the compromise between her human schedule and his nocturnal one. Ophelia went to the East Library and stood in it for a moment by herself, looking at the shelves that she had come to know the way you know something that has become part of your landscape, and she thought about Theron at 29 in the year 1641, in a world entirely different from this one. And she thought about the 400 years between that moment and this one, and she thought about what it meant to arrive in the life of someone who had been alone for that long and find that you were precise the shape of what they had been missing without knowing it. She was not naive about what the future would require. They had conversations ahead of them, real ones, about the length of her human life versus the length of his, about what she wanted and what he wanted and what they could honestly build together. Those conversations were not resolved, but they were not feared, which was the thing that mattered. They were simply ahead, waiting, in a future that she now had reason to navigate carefully rather than haphazardly. She heard him behind her in the doorway. She had learned his particular quality of presence well enough to identify it without looking. "Heloise says dinner is in 2 hours," he said. "I know," she turned around. "I was thinking. About what? About impermanence," she said, "and how it is not actually the enemy of love, it is the precondition of it." He looked at her. "Meaning," she continued, "that the finite quality of things is not what makes them painful. It is what makes them worth choosing." He came into the library and stood in front of her in the way he had, of occupying exactly the right amount of space, neither too close nor too far. And he looked at her with those pale silver eyes that she had been reading for almost a year now, like a language she was still learning and expected to spend a very long time improving in. I asked you for help once, he said, in Vienna, when I let you see that I did not know how to do this without hurting you. You did, she agreed. It was the most frightening thing I had done in a very long time. I would like to keep asking, he said, with the expectation that this is a standing invitation rather than a series of individual requests. She smiled. It always was. He took her hand and pressed it briefly to his mouth, not with the drama of a gesture performed for audience, but with the quiet certainty of someone marking something real, and she felt it move through her, the way warmth moves through cold, not sudden but complete. They went to dinner. They ate and talked. And she argued with him about the correct interpretation of the 17th century Dutch trade routes and their influence on the early vampire territory maps, which was an argument she was losing on the basis that he had been there, which was an unfair advantage, she told him, he was not allowed to use, and which he used anyway with a precision and a faint dry amusement that she had decided was the most attractive thing about him, which was saying something given the competition. The house moved around them, the staff at their quiet tasks, the city beyond the windows, doing what's do, enormous and impersonal and containing within it this particular room with these particular people. A woman who had learned to find angles and a vampire king who had spent 4 centuries believing that asking for anything was a risk he could not afford, and who had discovered, in the space of one honest conversation in a study lit by amber lamps, that the risk of asking was considerably smaller than the cost of never asking at all. Outside, London in October moved toward midnight in its ordinary way, taxis and fog, and the distant sound of traffic. And inside the townhouse in Mayfair, the East Library lamps burned warm, and the conversation continued, and the particular quality of being truly known by another person settled over the room like something that had been waiting to arrive for a very long time. Like the first real sunlight after a winter that has gone on longer than anyone anticipated. Astonishing, not because it was unexpected, but because even when you know the spring is coming, there is always a moment when you feel it, and it is still more than you remembered. She looked at him across the table and thought, here is a man who moved through 400 years alone, because he did not believe it was safe to need anything. And here is what happens when you show someone, carefully and honestly, and without agenda, that it is safe. They find their way home. She had done that. She was proud of it in the quiet way you are proud of things that took real courage and real patience, and the willingness to stay in a room, after the metaphorical knife has been pressed to your throat, and say, I am still here, and I still mean what I said, and I am not going anywhere. He caught her looking. He raised one pale eyebrow. She smiled and shook her head, and reached across the table and took his hand. Still thinking? He asked. Always, she said. His hand closed around hers. Outside the window, the city turned on its axis in the dark, and inside the amber warmth of the old house, 2 people who had arrived at each other through danger and diplomacy, and the particular alchemy of one person seeing another clearly enough to say, you can ask, and it will be safe, remained exactly where they were, and it was enough. And it was the beginning of everything.